Why does everything seem to be falling apart? Well, we have record waiting lists, sewage discharge, crumbling schools, growing potholes, all kinds of problems. Very difficult to see a doctor or a dentist. Why do things seem to be going wrong when, in theory, economic growth should enable better public services, not worse? Well, there's a few things going on. The first thing is that in the post-war period, we kind of got used to a virtuous circle of higher growth, higher tax revenues, enabling more spending on public services. But around the financial crisis of 2009-2010, there was a big drop-off in economic growth, especially per capita growth. Now, we often think of the 1970s as a period of recession, inflation, strikes, economic calamity. But if we look at per capita growth in the 70s, it was much higher than what we're experiencing now. Now, also, as well as this poor growth, there's been a lot of, you could say, short-termism. And I'll give you a few examples of what I mean. To meet government debt targets, one of the easiest things to do is to cut public sector investment. There's no short-term political cost to that. But if you keep underinvesting, then these problems mount up. It's a bit like the old adage that you go broke very slowly and then suddenly all at once. So the lack of investment in water, electricity grid, housing and transport, it does affect the economy. Now, it's not just about a lack of investment. If you take water, the privatisation was an additional complication in that the private firms, they paid themselves a lot of dividends, around £72 billion, and this affected the investment they were able to do. And we have actually invested in infrastructure like HS2. That's a lot of money, but quite a poor return. And the UK is just not very good at building things. So there's this combination of factors, low growth, lower tax revenues, but also not been particularly effective in spending the money that we do even have. Another example of short-termism, if we take the NHS, in recent years there's been a lack of training of nurses and doctors. So the NHS has this serious shortfall of skilled workers. Now, to meet this problem, the easiest thing to do is to rely on immigration, rely on agency workers. But in the long term, agency workers are more expensive. And last year there was a big increase in the amount spent on agency workers, around £10 billion. So if we had a longer term strategy of training more native-born doctors and nurses, it would help reduce some of the agency costs. Another issue is also the demographic changes to the economy. We've got an ageing population, also worsening health outcomes, which is quite concerning, and that has a big effect on productivity. But before I get that, we're just going to take a short break. So I'd just like to introduce today's video sponsor, which is HelloFresh. They deliver a wide variety of meals through the post, and you get these wonderful ingredients like this, and then you cook them up, and very easy to follow menu plan. And if you're like me, you tend to eat the same food every day. It's great to have a choice of a wide variety of new meals that you otherwise wouldn't get round to cooking. And it's quite easy to follow. Today we're making roasted aubergine and chickpea curry, and there's a simple 6-step plan to follow. I'm not a great cook, but nice and easy. And lots of lovely ingredients to work with. Chickpea, rice, aubergine, a bit of fresh garlic and some curry paste. So I'm going to cook this and we shall see what it's like in half an hour or so. So be back soon. So half an hour later and I've managed to cook the chickpea and aubergine curry. In fact, it's quite simple, just a few steps to follow. And it does give a sense of achievement to make a proper meal. It makes a change from pasta and sauce or the usual boring stuff that I make for myself. My neighbours in a band is just practicing next door. But I'm going to enjoy this chickpea curry, and worth checking out HelloFresh, lots of fantastic things to choose from. So I really enjoyed my chickpea curry. And if you'd like to give HelloFresh a go, there's a 60% discount code off your first order, plus 20% off for the first 2 months, and a free gift. So click on the description link or click on this QR code, and if you'd like to give it a try. Let's get back to the economics. So declining health outcomes are a particular concern because we've seen a rise in long-term sickness people leaving the labour market, and this directly affects productivity and economic growth. And the problem is that with lower economic growth, it means that the government have had to increase the tax burden, and yet at the same time haven't been able to improve public services. So even as taxes have been going up, debt has also been rising. So it's this unwelcome trade-off. It's a politically difficult choice because we're having higher taxes, kind of austerity in many public services, but also rising debt anyway. So this is one reason to explain the growing dissatisfaction. And unless there's a change in productivity and economic growth, this kind of stress on public finances will continue. Another question is it worth considering moving to other countries? Well, certainly the UK has some very real economic problems, but there's a saying that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. If you look at other economies, they also have their fair share of problems. Even in America, which from one perspective has very good economic statistics, high economic growth, much higher than the UK. And yet still many Americans feel dissatisfied with the economy. Although inflation has come down, they see the much higher price level. Although there's economic growth, many average workers feel that they've got very little in the way of savings, very high housing costs. And so if you look at Europe, they have had their own problems in the past decade with the debt crisis and quite low economic growth, especially in the south, although they're starting to catch up in the past few months. Now, an interesting question here is from someone, could you compare the UK and Australia? And they are fairly different economies, although they have some similarities. One big difference is Australia has much more commodities. Mining is a bigger share of the economy. So in the recent commodity price boom that we saw in the past 2 years, this kind of helped the Australian economy much more than the UK. And you can see this in the form of higher growth and higher tax revenues. So Australia last year had virtually a balanced budget, i.e. the government spending was the same as tax revenue. And that's a far cry to the UK. We had a budget deficit of around 5% of GDP. We've had a persistent big budget deficit for the past 13, 14 years. And the IMF state that Australia are one of the second best performing economies in terms of debt management. Net debt in Australia is around 23% of GDP. In the UK, public sector net debt is closer to 100% of GDP. So there are these differences. There is somewhat higher growth in the past few years, but there's also a lot of similarities. If you ask the average Australian householder how they're feeling, well, a lot have been squeezed by higher interest rates, cost of living, very high housing costs. And this is something that seems to be shared across the Anglosphere. In fact, many advanced countries, but English-speaking countries in particular, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, we have this scenario of very high housing costs. House price to incomes are very high, renting is expensive, and this is really reducing living standards, especially for young people or people who don't own their own homes. Again, there's a situation that even though Australia has slightly higher growth, if you take into account the population growth, it's similar to the UK in that GDP per capita is increasing at a slower rate, and with all the cost of living pressures, the average Australian householder isn't feeling particularly better off than the UK. So again, going back to this question, is it time to move? You know, Australia used to often be a destination for British immigrants who went away to get new opportunities. But there's a similar problems. There's still the same housing crisis and issues around very low growth in living standards. So it's not just the UK, even though I think it is fair to say the UK is doing relatively worse than the majority of advanced countries. What can ordinary people do to protect themselves from this never-ending economic disaster? Well, I think it is worth bearing in mind, although we talk a lot about the problems of the UK economy, not to over-exaggerate just how bad it is. You know, it's true that living standards have to some extent stagnated, but it's not like the Great Depression with mass unemployment. And I think the best thing you can do to protect yourself is to retain a flexibility. You know, artificial intelligence will definitely be changing the nature of jobs. And to be successful in the future labour market, we need to have as much adaptability and flexibility as we can. So keeping up with and new technology will be very important. In terms of investing, I've not got any particularly great advice except just try to diversify where you save money and don't rely necessarily on just one income source. Should the UK worry about its credit rating? Well, I don't think so, because bond markets don't pay too much attention to the credit rating that they get from an agency like Moody's or S&P. And if there's a downgrade, it doesn't make that much difference in reality. When should you worry about the debt to GDP level? Well, I always think this is a really interesting question, and I have touched on it before, but I'd like to take you back to 2010. There's a really interesting paper by Reinhardt and Rogoff published in 2010. And basically they stated in this paper that debt levels over 90% of GDP were very damaging. They led to much lower economic growth. And this paper became very influential in promoting austerity in America, Europe, and the UK. In particular, George Osborne referred to it many times when he justified his austerity of the early 2010s. Now, the problem with this paper is that it was seriously flawed. It was based on a mistake in an Excel spreadsheet, and the link between debt and economic growth was very marginal. And they basically got it wrong that after 90% debt, growth doesn't slow down anywhere near like what they stated. There's also an element of causation and effect. If your economy grows much more slowly, it will tend to push up debt to GDP, as you see in, say, Japan, Italy, and the UK. Now, when should you worry? The big thing is what else is happening in the economy. Japan, very high debt, close to 260% of GDP, but a lot of domestic savings, low inflation, and a lot of demand for government bonds. But you take another country with a history of inflation, economic volatility, and debt default, then debt is a much bigger problem. So Argentina's defaulted 5 times. At the moment, the UK doesn't need to panic about its debt levels. There's still quite high demand for buying government debt in the UK, and there's more room than many people might fear. However, there are a few warning signs for the longer term. We have this period of much lower economic growth, an ageing population, and political failings. We want to spend more on public services without increasing taxes. So I think that when you start to get rising debt because of you having to pay more pensions, this is a cause for concern, because where is the tax revenue going to come from if you've got an ageing population? What would happen if the UK somehow paid off its national debt? Well, that's definitely not going to happen anywhere near in the future. And to be honest, the answer is not that much. I mean, the UK, in theory, could pay off its national debt by massively increasing taxes, cutting government spending, and repaying all the bond owners. But what would actually happen in practice is it would be a kind of a redistribution from the average taxpayer to the more wealthy bondholders, because we would pay higher taxes and the government would repay bondholders, which tend to be wealthier, or banks or pension funds. So there wouldn't really be a better situation. I mean, on the one hand, you could say we pay less debt interest payments. And actually, that's a factor for when you should start worrying about debt to GDP. Because last year, the UK suddenly had to pay a lot more debt interest payments because of higher inflation, higher interest rates. And I think the bill was around £125 billion, which is equivalent to the education budget. So that is one factor of higher debt. You have to pay more debt interest payments. But whether you should worry or not really depends upon what else is happening in the economy. How high is inflation? Is there economic stability? And can the government be trusted to pay it back? Is there any chance that the UK will rejoin the European Union? 2 people ask this, so I don't think there is in the next 20 years. Maybe a new generation of politicians and a new generation of voters would want to go down that route. But there's definitely going to be no easy rejoining of the European Union, if only for the reason that the EU were very sceptical about going through the hassle of admitting the UK back into the EU. Brexit was very time-consuming, kind of a waste of energy, really. But what is more likely is that after the next election, like in 2029 or whenever that is, one of the main parties may commit to rejoining a customs union and possibly the single market. So you get closer convergence. And I think that is likely to some extent because there is somewhat of a cost to Brexit in terms of economic growth. And there's always going to be a pressure to reduce these trade frictions that have created in the past few years. And Brexit vote is very much based on demographics. So as older voters, let's say, pass on to the higher world, then there will be a bigger majority for closer alignment to the European Union. But rejoining is a very big step, hard to see in the foreseeable future. A final question: economics doesn't seem to do a very good job at promoting the environment and biodiversity. And I think that's a fair point, but I think it really raises the issue of what does a society value? And economics traditionally has placed a lot of emphasis on GDP. And in fact, I talk a lot about that in my videos on economic growth. And in the current climate of a cost of living crisis, it becomes much harder to say we have to prioritize the environment and biodiversity when many people are struggling to pay their bills. And certainly in the past few years of low growth, environmental issues have taken some more of a back seat than might have happened if we had higher growth. But I do think it is possible to combine both, because a lot of environmental policies are very compatible with economic growth. So, for example, even in the UK, CO2 emissions have fallen quite dramatically in the past couple of decades. And that isn't a barrier to economic growth because of all the new technology and solar panels and wind power, a lot of potential there for having more renewable energy without harming growth. In fact, it could help growth. If we invested more in renewable energy, then that would have avoided some of the costs of 2022 when gas prices went through the roof. Anyway, thanks for listening. And if you like this video, do check out this other one with lots of readers' questions that I have answered.